All right, so we have now opened this conference and it is time for our keynote speaker. This woman will share her expertise about how to move from knowledge to knowing and knowledge management in order to create learning culture. She is a professor in Organisational Learning and Leadership at BI, Norwegian Business School, and Professor Second at the Norwegian Police University College. Please give a warm welcome to Cathrine Filstad.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've been to several times to NAV in Norway, but of course I'm not familiar with other ways of working when it comes to helping people going out to the labor market, going into analysis, stuff like that. But what I have been doing is that I've been working on organizational learning for maybe 25 years. And what strikes me is that I tend more or less to talk about the same things that I did 25 years ago. And that is very interesting because I think it has something to do with that we skip the more starting points, the more discussing what learning is all about, what knowledge is, what competence is. I think that is the main issues that we're striving with in the organization, that we don't really have a common interpretation of the different terms that we can use in order to have a common ground on how to work on organizational learning. And also when I started on these things 25 years ago, it was also related to that we didn't think of practice as a learning arena. And that was also the main issue when I went into this, because I've been working for several years in the different businesses. I started out going into academia, more like coming in from the side, thinking that, okay, I have this experience from practice. Now I want to take the different degrees, take a PhD, stuff like that, but I also wanted to study learning, because what I met was very often that I met this individual definition of what learning was all about. It was very much related to this individual cognitive approach to learning, which is to say that, okay, as long as I'm standing here, talking to you guys, telling you about this different stuff, then you can learn from that, you can store it, and then you can use it in a future situation. And it doesn't really work that way when it is in an organization, does it? Because then you have to relate to people. Then you have to find out a way to learn how to approach people and how to apply different kind of knowledge and when to apply this different kind of knowledge. So when it comes to learning in an organization, it's much more complicated. And it's not necessarily about the knowledge that you have, but it's more also about the social skills that you have, the different overview that you have, the awareness of people working together, being within different professions, for instance. It's much more complicated. And also it's not that if I tell you something here and you find that this is a good idea and you think that, okay, I want to apply this when I come home, then you have to get people to get it, to convince people that it's a good idea too. And then you have to go into this dynamic in the organization. And that is also, since I'm working a lot with learning, I've been working with learning all this time as well. About leadership as well. And that is the same thing when it comes to leadership training, when it comes to leadership development, when it comes to going into leadership course. I'm from BI Business, Norwegian Business School, and of course we delivered a lot of leadership courses. The director from BI is not so glad when I'm talking about these things, but my message is very often that how many leadership courses do you actually need? How many people that I have in different courses, because I'm also teaching in these courses, how many of them doesn't know about what it takes to be a good leader? And what I also say sometimes, if you haven't read all the latest books, you can Google it. And then you will find these 10, these 15 different points on what it takes to be a good leader. And then of course you have knowledge about being a good leader. It's not enough, is it? But because you have to apply this knowledge in a practical situation, and you have to develop your own unique way of leadership. And you're not a better leader than in relations to those you are leading. And that is also the same thing when it comes to this other kind of knowledge that we actually learn from education, we learn from different courses, we learn from all the things that we do all the time in order to develop our skills, develop our knowledge. That the way to go from having knowledge about that to actually know what to do when, that is when it's getting more complicated. That's when it takes that you have to have the experience, you have to relate to people. My point is also that you have to reflect together in order to see what is this all about. It's like Eva was saying, that it's not that we start something without having some experience from before. So it's also, when it comes to change processes, it's about this balance between what do we already know, what do we have, what is the good experience that we already have in relations to what can we then find is good solutions on develop these things further. I've been working with the police, the Norwegian police, in the last 4 years. And of course they are in the midst of a huge reform. Actually, they were supposed to be finished with the reform now, 4 years later. And of course still having maybe 4 more years, or when they talk about changing cultures, how long do you need them? 10, 15, 20, maybe you need to shift the organization more or less altogether in order to change culture. So it's very complicated, and I think that we have to live with that. I think that we have to live with this complex kind of organization every day. It's not that we go into this and then we have solved this, and that is also why this organizational learning concepts as such is related to talking about learning as a verb all the time. Talking about this as related to the knowing, not the knowledge. Knowing how in this concrete situation. And that's why I'm also very, very glad when I end up with having presentations with people that actually are just having this as maybe an inspiration. We'll see what you think about that. But also going into a few concepts, a different common interpretation of what we are going to talk about, and then actually do the job. Actually start discussing, reflecting, thinking, how can I relate this to my kind of work? Things like that. Because that's what we need to do in the organizations as well. Every time we see, and especially when it comes to public organization, every time something goes wrong, and then of NAV, every time you have the headlines in the tabloids, and the politician go out and say, okay, we're going to solve this. And what do they say that we're going to solve this by? We just send them to courses. New courses, the same in the police. Send the police leaders to leadership courses. The challenge that we have in most organizations is not that we don't have enough knowledge. Because we have so much education. We take so many courses. The challenge that we have is actually to get people to have the possibility to use that knowledge in a practical situation. And that is also why we have to focus on the practice. When I'm talking, and also when I have my Master of Science students at BIA, it's very interesting because when I start talking, it's more like, okay, what do we need this education for? Can't we just go home and start working immediately? It's not that I'm not saying that we don't need the education. It's not that we don't need the courses, because we have to have that as well. Not only that. And that is the easiest part, isn't it? To send people to courses. And then the top management can say, okay, but now we have more skills, now we have more knowledge in the organization because we have had all our leadership groups within 2 years in these kind of courses. But we don't facilitate, do we, as much as we could have, in order then to have the same leaders have the possibility to have networks internally in the organization. How do they meet in leadership meetings, for instance? How can we facilitate so that they actually are challenged and also take on different a difficult leadership, for instance, conversations that they have to have with their employees, conflicts that they have to solve as their leaders, stuff like that. How can we facilitate that to make sure that they actually learn through the task that they have to solve? And also, how can we open so that the same leaders are able to observe other leaders that actually are able to do this and have solved this before and have some interesting experience, and then they are able to discuss later on. So are you with me so far when it comes to how to approach organizational learning? People are nodding. That's a very good start. I think you're supposed to have, maybe it's, yeah, here it is. And I always have a PowerPoint. I'm not very good at following PowerPoints. So that's a good idea that you actually have the PowerPoints in front of you. But what I wanted to start with is also that you have a lot of literature on these things. You have a lot of literature on organizational learning, also the learning organization. And a lot of, also in NAV, but a lot of organizations has that in their strategy document, don't they? Say that, okay, we are going to be a learning organization. But it also said 2 more pages. It says that, okay, we have to be good at knowledge sharing, we have to be knowledge-based, and then it's starting, and it's continuous and it continues. Instead of opening one of the boxes, if you call the organization, and if you want to go and use the term organizational learning, that's fine, but then it will include all the other things that is in the strategy document. And also, if you want to call the organizational learning organization, that's good too. Or if you want to call it a knowledge-based organization, or whatever you want to call it up front. As long as you stick to one, and then you open it. So it's not that you can't talk about being a learning organization, even though that the literature is a bit critical when it comes to, or people are being a bit critical when it comes to the literature, because it says that, okay, the learning organization literature is a bit normative. It's maybe too high up on a level, not so much on a micro level. But that doesn't really matter, does it? If you use that concept and you go into, say, okay, we want to be a learning organization. Because then you can say, what do we want to have as a content for being a learning organization? Or as I use as a concept very often that I talk about, creating a strong learning culture. But what you find is that you have all this literature, which of course people learn in all these courses that you have, but it's about then taking that into the organization, open the concept. You don't have to follow that theoretically either. You can say, okay, this is how we want to use this concept on an overview level. And this is what it has when it comes to consequences. So what I'm doing now is that I'm opening this learning culture concept, which is of course the same content that you could have if you call the organization a learning organization, but it's more like, what do we have to do then? What do we have to do then in order then to create this strong learning culture or be a learning organization as a verb, as the dynamic, as something that you're not a learning organization here and there, but you all have to continuously developing in order to be a learning organization. Same as a leader. You're not a good leader is not that something that you are, but it's something that you continuously have to be. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. So if I'm doing a very good performances today as a leader, it doesn't really help me in 1 month. So it's about this dynamic. Always have to learn new things, always have to develop, always have to figure out new things in order then to provide the motivation, for instance, for my employees. And the same will be when it comes to the labor market, getting people into the labor market. You have a lot of knowledge about the labor market. You know what it takes to go into the labor market. You have all this analysis about that. But every time is that one individual that you are going to help, which is a unique individual, which has different luggage when it comes to going into the labor market. And that is still something that you have to deal with every day. how can you then translate the knowledge that you have about the labor market to get this person motivated, facilitate so that the person maybe can qualify more for the labor market, and then go into a new job in the labor market, and perhaps also follow up on the individual. That is what, maybe not you guys anymore, but that's what's happening for those being in front of the organizations that you represent. That's what they do every day. And that's what you measured according to. It doesn't help that you sit here as leaders thinking, okay, you're really good leaders, and I'm very convinced that Eva is a good leader, and Eva is very convinced that Benedicte is a very good leader. It doesn't really help, does it, that we just say, okay, we are good leaders, as long as the people out there are not competent when the struggling is there every day. As a salesman will say that when the battle is going on out there. If you look at this, and if you look at what I think is the biggest challenge that we have in order to be good on organizational learning, is that we need to be much better at knowledge sharing. And that is knowledge sharing in practice. Knowledge sharing through how we work together, but also knowledge sharing and how we reflect on the practice, how can we develop the practice, and what are we good at today? And actually when I've gone into, because of course going into these kind of topics that I've been working on for such a long time, then of course I've been to all kinds of organizations. And what happens every time is that when I start talking about this stuff, and then they say, okay, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but in our organization we are very special. And all kind of organizations says that. It's like, yeah, of course you're special related to the topic or the profession that you are within. So that is, you can be special there. But when it comes to how we learn, when it comes to how we can facilitate this thing, when it comes to leadership, it's the same. You don't learn in a different way, even though that you are within your kind of businesses. The police doesn't learn in a different way than if you work in the health sector. But they learn different things. And that is also very interesting when we go into that. And also, we also learn very, very much informally in the organization. It's not that we can say that, okay, everything that is formal in the organization is what I learn from. Maybe the leaders probably would prefer that it actually was the case, that people only learn in the formal places, the formal organization, stuff like that. But actually when we look at change processes, most learning is happening informally in the organization. And that is also what we have to relate to, because then what kind of knowledge, what kind of competence is then related to when people learn informally, in informal groups, in informal, on informal arenas, on these different kind of meeting points that you actually have facilitated for here, because a lot of this informal learning is also something that we want to encourage. So that people are able to reflect, that people are able to use their knowledge. If they have a difficult case, for instance, because unless they will just find their colleagues that they would prefer to talk with, and also maybe they don't find them within the organization, maybe they find them outside the organization as well. So if you look at these different concepts that we could have talked about all of them, is that when we talk about going from the individual to what is in the organization, going from individual learning to organizational learning, from individual knowledge to organizational knowing, how do we go from the individual to the organization? We have to share knowledge. Because otherwise, if the knowledge and the competence is very much related to me as a person, if I leave the organization, then of course the organization have to develop that knowledge all over again. And that is the huge challenge, because very often, if you go back to the people that is working directly to, you don't call them customer, but I'm not sure what you call it in English. Not patients either, something between customer and patient. Help me here, Lily.
Job seekers.
Job seekers, that's my, that was the simplest term to use there. But when you go back to those having conversations with job seekers, then you will find that very often they're not together with their colleagues. They do that individually, talking to people that want to go out and work. Other kind of organization is very often the same. Me, I'm an academic. When I hold presentations, I can, maybe in the last 20 years, maybe 10 times I've been together with my colleagues. So very often, when we are at the arena where we are supposed to be most competent, because of course we are agreeing on that, that of course if we are not competent when it comes to helping people, then of course it doesn't help what we do in the rest of the organization. So where we are supposed to be most competent, we are very much the individual. And then of course, what kind of knowledge you develop there is it's extremely important for the organization as such. And you have a lot of tacit knowledge too, because they are very good at looking at the person that is applying for a job, helping the person, what kind of person are we talking to here, how can I motivate this person. You always use a lot of time to get to know the person in order then to help, and what kind of background does this person have. So you, all the time you then consider that individual person in relation to think, okay, what does it take to get that person motivated, trying to go into different kind of work, stuff like that. So that is what we do all the time. And that you do that too, but maybe not directly to the one that is in that position. But you do that too when it comes to people that you are leading, colleagues, networks, as you have here, in order to get good relations, and also in order then to get knowledge from each other, but also in order to help each other. So that is the most important thing that we actually do. And also intra-professionally. Because you have to do that. The police have to do that extremely, more and more. You have to cooperate with other professions as well. And that is also part of that. Then you have to find a common ground, a common language on how to have this kind of cooperation. To share knowledge so that you get enough knowledge in order then to help, again, the people that we are there for. Police is very focused on that all the time, because every second sentence they talk about who are we there for. And that is extremely important in a huge, complex organization, to still focus on who are we there for in our organization. So the knowledge sharing is a tip here when it comes to how to go further on this. So, what do we do then? I've just used this in relation to leadership, which is then of course related to all the kind of competence that you have in the organization. But it's about these different concepts, and it's not so many concepts that we need, or term if you prefer. Because it's just talking about the difference between having knowledge about things and then having competence, or having the knowing to know how to perform in that concrete situation. So, but if we introduce that to our colleagues in our departments, and also, but how do we get people to get from having knowledge about things and then knowing or having the competence as something that has to happen all the time? Another term is the difference between explicit and tacit knowledge. The explicit knowledge, which is then of course very easy to talk about, if you are in a meeting, for instance, to inform through the explicit knowledge. So the explicit knowledge is the knowledge that you can express through the use of language. That is explicit knowledge. The tacit knowledge is the other way around, so that that is the knowledge that is very difficult, very often impossible to express explicitly. That is the tacit knowledge. And I'm going to relate this to what is then the important learning arenas in order then to share the tacit knowledge. Which is then, of course, it's more challenging than sharing the explicit knowledge. We are extremely good at sharing explicit knowledge. That's why we have all these meetings. Because we think that, okay, as long as we sit together, then we can share knowledge. We end up very often with not even sharing information, but just saying, okay, this is my working, that's what I've been doing, and that this is what I'm going to do in the future, and then we end up just informing each other in most meetings. And that is a huge difference. And then also when it comes to the learning, because and that was starting in early 1990. The book from on situated learning was from 1991. Situated learning by Leben Wenger. Probably read it or even or heard about it.
Yes.
Anyone?
Yes.
Yes. Very good. So it's a long time ago that they started on this situated learning as a protest to the more individual cognitive learning. Because of course the psychologist has had the possibility to dominate the learning literature for a very long time. You probably heard about Skinner's dogs, you probably heard about this Pavlov's dogs. I mean, when it comes to learning related to more with the animals. So that they started with this cognitive revolution in the 1950s. That was the starting point on looking at the individual cognitive information processes that we actually have in order to leave the dogs behind, see what is the difference when it comes to humans. But still, it's very individual. The individual cognitive learning is very individual, related to what you know already, related to the new knowledge of the informations. When I'm talking to you, for instance, when I use the different terms, you probably have had some experience, you have some knowledge that actually you can put what I'm saying into that, and then you are in the information process. When I talked about Leben Wenger, then you probably have some pictures on the book maybe, or something like that. You have some kind of that, and then you start this information processing. But that is very individual. And that doesn't mean that individual cognitive learning doesn't have any value. Of course it is. It's there all the time. But what was the starting point from 1991, more or less, was that we looked at also on learning as learning through participation, learning in relation, as learning as relational, learning related to this concrete situation. What does this concrete situation require when it comes to different kind of knowledge? So much more on this word, not so mechanical when it comes to I've learned this is something that I know, then I can use this in a future situation. So it's about, when you are going to apply these things in organization, it's about combining the two. And a way to combining the two is also in the literature, even though that academics are terrible when it comes to that, because of course you have a lot of academics going in this direction when it comes to learning as participation, learning through practice. And then of course you have the psychologist's individual cognitive learning approach. What is learning all about? So when it comes to interprofessional things that you're striving with, just go into the academic world. But when it comes to what they are agreeing upon is that how to combine the two is through reflection. And when it comes to the knowledge that you have, when it comes to what you have learned, it's very complicated to know when am I learning, what have I learned. When you finish after these 2 days, what did you learn after 2 days? And when are we going to measure it? Are we going to measure it after 2 days? Are we going to measure it after half a year to see if you actually have used it in the organization? So that is also a tendency that we have, that we want to measure learning all the time, and measure learning in relations to the knowledge. And how complicated is knowledge? Because a lot of that knowledge is tacit. So if we then end up with just measuring what is explicit knowledge, what are we then missing out? So that is also extremely important, that when we facilitate for these things, and the first thing is to get rid of all the economics when you go into these discussions in the organization, because they only want percentages, they only want effects on all the activities that you actually are facilitating. That is a good starting point. Because a lot of the things that's going on in the organization, it's not possible to measure. It's not possible to measure the effect directly. It's not that if we go into facilities, these learning activities, then we will have these results. But indirectly, we can of course look at, are people more motivated in our organizations? Are our customers more satisfied in our organizations? Do we have a large turnover in our organizations? So we have different kind of measurements that we can use, but not directly, but more indirectly and over a longer period of time. So that is also about the patience that we need to have when it comes to facilitating the different learning activities in the organization. So it is about this bridge between knowledge and knowing. In the leadership literature, we haven't figured out the bridge. And a lot of different professions are striving with that. And what is then to balance this going from knowledge to knowing? It's hard work. It's hard work every day. Learning is hard work. And the good thing about that is about this dynamic, but the other thing is that very often if you actually are going to learn something, then you also have to go out outside your comfort zone. That too. Because otherwise you end up with, and that is, then you're very optimistic. And we tend to do that. We do the same thing. And we have done the same thing several times, and then expect a different outcome. Then we are very positive people. So it's about trying to figure out what is the starting point there. What are we doing wrong? I need to work on these things as a leader, as an employee, stuff like that, which is then makes it more complicated. Some people do that, some find it more difficult. Some people we need to help more than others in order then to go out of this comfort zone. Because that's where learning is actually happening. Learning in relation also to going into more difficult tasks, taking the challenges in everyday life, work. So that you actually, if there's a difficult task, use it instead of just ignoring it, or maybe hope it goes away. Going into that, maybe use your colleagues. If it's a difficult conversation that you have to take with your colleagues, or if there is a difficult situation that you have to go into in organization, that's what you learn the most. But then, of course, very often you'll find that can be difficult to do individually. So maybe you need some backup, maybe you need more facilitation than other needs in order to go into the same thing. Because if you end up with this no mistake society, which can be often the case, because otherwise you end up in this tabloid newspaper again. But if we end up with a society that is based on no mistakes, that's not much learning, is it? So this has something to do with also to go into the challenging. We don't really know what will be the outcome. But what we know here is what can be the best solution. And then we have to adjust that as we go along. And then, of course, it's very difficult to do that individually. But if you have the whole leadership group, for instance, with you, or if you have your colleagues with you and in relations to your leader, then of course it's more easier to do that, because then you have the backup. Also, if things is turning out to be more complicated, more difficult than you actually thought it would be. So that's The knowledge, going from the knowing to the knowledge, but also from the explicit knowledge to the tacit knowledge. And actually, when it comes to, because I go into a lot of organization on these things, we don't really need so much more than these terms and go in and discuss this. If we have a common interpretation of what knowing and what learning is all about, learning as individual cognitive, learning as participation and practice, and if we have learning on this individual cognitive level, very often related to courses, training, also when it comes to education, and we know that in order then to take advantage and really help the organization as knowing in the organization, as competence in the organization, we know that the facilitation has to be between the two. So that is also back to this one. Here you have the facilitation in the organization. You can't facilitate all, but as a leader you can facilitate some of these things. The good thing is also that the same people in the top management that actually have wrote on your strategy document that they want to be a learning organization, if they don't know that, it should be others that actually tell them what that actually means. Because you need to have the support from top management in order then to be good at learning. Because otherwise, of course, it will just be up to the individual in the organization, which actually are very motivated. We want to do this, even though the top management are measuring us on all other stuff. We really want to do that. But then, of course, the learning in the organization is related to the individuals and also the individual's motivation, not the system as such. And that is also extremely difficult. And because the people, after 4 years of having to do that, despite how it's facilitated in the organization, the people will leave. And then you end up with the best people leaving. They will find another organization that actually will facilitate, actually will appreciate this kind of focusing on learning, on knowledge sharing, stuff like that. And the main point is also, I had a bad day in the police here 2 weeks ago. I was in the police directorate. They were then going into the strategy documents again. And then, of course, they had this learning as one of the main goals in the organization. But they also had that related to results orientation. So they said learning and results orientation. And then they found out, okay, we take this learning out. I'm not finished with those guys, so we will probably work more. At this point, I'm only doing the research, and then I will come back after the research and working with these guys. But what do you think was why they took the learning out? I think they don't really grasp what learning is all about. But the result orientation, that's much better. And then we can measure how long does it take for the police to come to the scene, or how many percentages are solved when it comes to different kind of crime, stuff like that. That is the hard part of that. Much easier than this learning thing stuff. But what is the main message here is that we can't do anything without learning. We have to start with learning. This is the learning that we facilitate for. So that is the starting point. But of course, it's not learning as such that we are interested in. We are interested in the results of the learning. But it's the learning that we have to facilitate for. And that is also extremely important. And when people don't really recognize that, and more or less recognize, okay, we can't afford all this learning because then we have to have all these people in the course, or that is something, that learning is something that is happening outside the content of the work that you're going to do, then it's a different story. But when you look at this, it's about having as much learning as possible in relations to the work that you do every day. To integrate learning as part of how to solve the job. That is the main message when it comes to be good at organizational learning. But that also takes that each and every one of the people working in the organization has to take that responsibility. So the people working out towards the clients, for instance, they also have to open that box. They also have to invite the colleagues in, or they have to be open in order to discuss and share their knowledge, but also be open on the knowledge that they actually don't have. Because that is also what knowledge sharing is all about. Because if I wait until I'm quite sure about these things before I then talk with you about these things, it doesn't really help me at all. Because still I have to figure this out individually by myself. But if I'm not sure about these things, and I think, okay, but I think you have more knowledge about this than I have, then I have to be open on what knowledge I don't have. That is what knowledge is all about. Knowledge sharing is all about. And that's why it's more complicated than just sharing information. Because then you have to have this openness on being not all together, but at least being in a situation that you're more vulnerable because you're open on the knowledge that you don't have. And that's why we talk about this, and a lot of literature talk about this knowledge sharing related to trust. So a lot of the literature that you will read on knowledge sharing, you will always have a title related to knowledge sharing and trust, because the trust has to come first. And especially if you share knowledge and then you figure out, okay, then the individual that you share knowledge with will then just turn around and tell the other colleagues, well, Cathrine doesn't know about this things. So how can this happen further? You have to get rid of her or whatever it is. So the point is that if you have that experience once, then of course you won't share knowledge anymore. You will probably share the knowledge in informal groups. So that's why these informal groups is so important. So I'll just continue a bit further on that. What we start with very often when it comes to thinking about organizational learning as creating a strong learning culture is that why I use this term culture is about saying that, okay, this is something that we're used to this. We are used to this way of working. We are used to looking for the different learning arenas. We have identified different learning arenas for our departments. That can shift, that can develop, that can change. But we also have a common ground on what kind of knowledge do we want to share. What does it take to have the trust between colleagues and in relation to the leader in order to share knowledge? And then we will have the same thing when it comes to that department working together with other professions, for instance. When it comes to the police, that has to work with the child care, different kind of organizations as well, or when it comes to working with those being responsible for holding or not holding restaurants open, stuff like that. You have a lot of different professions that also are going to work together. So you also have to take on the different learning arenas. That's why when I talk about these things, and that's why I was also saying that, okay, it's very interesting that you do this, that you have this kind of start here with me first, and then you go into and discuss these things. Because a lot of times I'm asked, yeah, but how do we do this? And then I just say back again, I say, okay, here is some kind of frame. Here is some kind of terms that you can go into. But each and every organization has to work this through and also develop this in their own organization. So even though I have some knowledge on NAV and how you guys are working, after I've been working in health sector, I've been working in the bank, in different kind of organizations, but you have to go from this more macro level, which is very much related to the theories in learning organization, which doesn't take into account the different kind of profession, the different kind of concepts, such as that. You have to work on this in that particular organization. Who are working here? What kind of tasks do they need to solve? What kind of knowledge development do they need in order then to meet the future demands or expectations in this particular profession. So that is also part of that. And also related to how much can you read about this stuff instead of doing the hard work actually to implement this as a way of working in the organization. And we are very poor at knowledge sharing in the organization, also related to trust. Because, and I also find that in the new generation, because you would think that the new generation is better at knowledge sharing, wouldn't you? And to some extent they are. But they're also very focused on who are going to tell me what. And that's the same in the organization. Who are you, Eva, to tell me that I don't know that? You're not my leader. And how can we then find a way to actually give constructive feedback to each other without people feeling that you go over the line on what you actually are responsible for, or that they feel that this is very difficult to relate to, so I don't like you anymore. So it's very difficult when it comes to these things. And actually that was the same thing, because I have to tell you about this. I have these Master of Science students at BI, and we have a lot of exchange students, so they are from all over the world. But mostly, maybe half of them are Norwegian students. Every time they hold presentations on the different topics, and they have opponents. And they are very good students, so of course the presentations are very good, and they work very hard. I know this is going to happen every year, so that's also part of the learning process that we actually are doing. But the first presentation, and of course a very good presentation, the first presentation is very good, but when the opponents come in and they're going to get some kind of feedback, where they are told to be very constructive on that, and then they start, this is good, this is good, this is good, blah, 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 and then maybe this number 10 is, maybe you could have, if that's possible, blah, 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 you could have done something different. Back again, that is what they focus on. What do you mean by that? Of course, the bias here is that they actually are graded towards that, but at the same time it says something about getting that kind of feedback from me, that's okay. But when you get that from a fellow student, but what is also very interesting is that, I'm not sure if you have other people from France here, because when I have French students, I always put them as opponents first. Because then you have 5, and then you have 5. And then of course the Norwegian students are like, wow, what is happening here? So that is also a culture difference when it comes to what kind of feedback do you give to whom, related to what culture that you are brought up in. So that's why they have all these strikes as well, because the French, they really can go on strike. In Norway, we're not very good at this stuff. But what we have to do is that we have to, in each department, and in relation to the leader, we have to find what is the good learning arenas. And of course, we have a lot of good learning arenas already. So it's not that we start all over again. But what kind of learning arenas doesn't really work? It's still there. No one knows why we are still at the same learning areas, but when we started there, they have done that for the last 20 years, so who am I to change this stuff? Going into that and relate this to where is then knowledge sharing actually happening? Where is it a good learning arena? And what I also very often do is that I challenge people to say, okay, but the main 3 to 5 learning arenas. One is, of course, when you are in the meeting with the client, when you are at that level. And maybe then the first line manager will say, okay, what is then the other learning arenas which then will help the person or my employees when he's on that learning arenas? And how do we get then the learning that is happening there in relation to the client? Not in relation to the employees, but in relation to the client and all the tacit knowledge that is actually developing there. How can we then share that knowledge in our department? So that is also back to this trust, back to opening some of the learning areas where we tend to be not visible for our colleagues, doing a lot of interesting, knowledgeable stuff, but not being available for our colleagues. So that is a very good starting point. And because also related to the different learning arenas is that what we can measure, what we can talk together with in a meeting, for instance, is what is just the top of the iceberg. What is explicit in the knowledge. When it comes to the training, when it comes to this individual knowledge development, stuff like that, it's only the top of the iceberg. It's here that we actually has to work. It's here we have the knowledge, it's here that we have to build on this trust. It's not that we have to, and to be clear, it's not that we have to like people. It's very nice when we do that. But it's not that we have to like, we don't have to understand everything about that person. That's not what trust is all about. But we have to trust that when we share knowledge here, it's not something that is happening, it's about integrity. It's not something that will stay in this room. And when I trust in my leader, I also expect that he doesn't talk about me in a negative way towards to other colleagues, for instance. So it's about this integrity, which is then extremely important. Actually, is integrity more important for people in organizations than when it comes to knowledge? And that is extremely important. And now we can't see anything anymore because how the sun comes in. But I said it's very difficult to grasp. So that was the sun that we have arranged for that. To see this is very blurry. It's not so it's very difficult to grasp and at least measure, and also the visibility in that. And that is also important. It doesn't really matter. It's working very fine. So when I ask people then, are you good at knowledge? I don't ask that, then I will ask not up in front, but trying to figure out the knowledge sharing. I say, do you share knowledge in your organization? And people will say, yes, we do. And then I start to, what kind of knowledge do you share, or can you describe a bit on how you share knowledge? And it's very often that, yeah, but if I think that I have to talk with the colleagues, it's very often that I can just pop in, or take a telephone, or go and send an email. When it comes to popping in, it's working very fine if he has the time. So what we find is that the answer to the question on if they're good at knowledge sharing is very much related to, if I need my colleagues and I just pop into his office and he's available, then we will talk. And that is, of course, an important knowledge sharing, could be an important way of sharing knowledge, but it's very much information sharing, isn't it? And it's very much by chance that he actually is available and he actually has the time. But it's not, if he doesn't have the time, people are still thinking, okay, it's not his fault that he doesn't have the time, so it's a very positive thing related to that. But it doesn't really help, does it? That we know that people want to share knowledge with us, but they don't have the time, or we don't really have the arenas where we have the possibility to share that knowledge. So that is also important. But what is also important that I think we have to be more concrete on what kind of knowledge do we expect people to share. It's not that we said, okay, if I'm going to talk with you, we're going to go together, just make sure that this is only the knowledge and so everything else isn't worth anything. That is important too, because it helps very much to get to know people. It helps a lot to get more into their interpretation of different stuff, their sense of reality, stuff like that. That is also extremely important when it comes to the next round, when it comes to the trust. But we have to at least then say, okay, this time we want to share the knowledge related to, for instance, what is the challenge that we have when it comes to the new generation, when it comes to people from, as you have, from maybe 18 to 28 or something like that. That is what is the main purpose of this knowledge sharing. Because we are the people that actually are going to solve this thing in the organization. And then of course it will be other things that we actually share. And also not the leader that once you start to talk about your family or friends or something like that, you have a leader behind you and say, is that relevant for this knowledge sharing? We have to also have leaders that actually trust that this is a way of people sharing that knowledge. As long as you're concrete on this is the main purpose of the knowledge sharing, and then of course the other is a bonus for people to get to know each other more in that. So what kind of knowledge to be shared on different learning arenas? And then of course, when it comes to who is then the knowledge sources. And we have a lot of role models in the organization. And of course, for those of you that are not Norwegian, that is not so interesting. But this is father and son in the Norwegian television. And I've been working, when I took my PhD, I was working on this term role models. Unfortunately, the son wasn't on television then, because otherwise I would use that anyway, to see what this role modeling is all about, and also say that, okay, it's not that extreme in real life. Maybe not in this case either, but it looks a bit extreme when it comes to the father going in the footsteps of his, and the son going into the footsteps of his father. But what we have, and what is important here is this observational learning, this vicarious experience that we often think about, related to that when I'm observing others in the organization, it's not that I have to do all the experiences myself. It's very much related to observational learning, which is that I see what that person does, I see the consequences of what that person wants, and then I look at, I'm considering, am I able to do the same thing if I'm looking for the same consequences? So that is also this dynamics that we have in the organization. Observing people, seeing what they are doing, ending up with not doing that, because, I said, okay, I don't want to work 24/7 for 3 months in order to get that new position. And also related to that, it's also related to, I see the person doing that, I can consider if I want to do that, but also is it my leader fair, so that if I work three years 24/7, will I have the same possibilities? So we are fascinated creatures when it comes to how we relate to people in that way. But also, when it comes to this role modeling, put that into this informal learning. Because that is extremely important also. Who is role modeling? It's not one person. We don't have a, yeah, maybe some of us have, but we don't have a hero in the organization. But we have people that we look up to in the way that we think, okay, but this is something that I want to learn from. Part of that, and the other way around. This is definitely something that I don't want to do. And that is a vicarious experiences as well. So, that was just the starting point. Because we have this community of practice. That is a theory that we use also within organizational learning when it comes to looking at this different network, when it comes to looking at the informal grouping in the organization. And in this case, it's very much related to identification, and we want to belong at work. More and more, actually. Because now work is more and more being within what we talked about earlier when it comes to when we were studying at school. We talked about these primarily relations, which is very often related to close friends, families, and that is what we're looking for also at work. And that is also something that we find in the literature on communities of practice. Communities of practice is informal. But when you talk about communities of practice, it's the informal grouping and the informal way of people creating meaning, belonging, but also you have a lot of knowledge within these groups. And that is also extremely important when it comes to knowledge sharing. And also when it comes to how knowledge is flowing in the organization. Because, of course, these informal groups can also can be characterized as in-groups. So you tend then to not share knowledge with others. We have this tendency also as people that once we are in a group, we are very fast being an in-group, and then of course the others are on the outside. So that is also part of that. But think about this grouping in your own organization. It can be related to being in the same age. It can be related to nationality, at least if you work in a multinational company, or if you are from England and work in a Norwegian environment, for instance. It can be related to gender. It can be related to where you live in your own country, north, coming from the south, different things like that. It can be related to gender. What is then important here is that it's related to your identity. And the more it's related to your identity, the stronger this community or practice is. So if it's very, very important for you to identify and belong in that group, then of course the stronger this group will be as an in-group. When the top management are deciding upon change, thinking this is a good idea, in a lot of organizations, creating meaning of this idea and also discussing how can we relate to this new vision, for instance, or these new goals, or this change process. Very often the discussion is informally in these groups. So that is also important as a leader. How can we facilitate for that? If you know that this change is going directly into these 4 people that actually every time it's about change, they will just do all the best in order then to stop this or work as they always have. And the other way around, the informal group there would actually encourage also be a very important support on what is going on. But the leader can't then just say, okay, you can't relate to each other, so then you will always have the leader that the leader can only facilitate in the formal organization. So that is a possibility there. But of course you can't deny people to meet or having lunch together or maybe meet outside the organization. But what it says something about is that what we want to have in the formal organization related to knowledge sharing is trust. Trust as integrity, trust related to this belonging, and of course trust related to the knowledge. And that we very often find in what is informal. It doesn't mean that it's a sign of a sick organization if you have a lot of communities of practice, a lot of informal groups. Not at all. But it's about the leaders being aware of that is also part of, and get these people involved when it comes to, for instance, big change processes. And I'm talking all the time. Okay. So this is then the final one. The other one was then related to the trust. And also remember that when we go into this and do studies on this trust, is that trust in the leader is of course not taken for granted, but of course you need to trust your leader. But when it comes to the things that we're talking about here, is that trust in your employees, your colleagues. Trust in your colleagues is most important. And that is related to what I've been talking about the whole time today. It's related to that you need each individual to want to share knowledge. You need each individual to take some initiative. Because as a leader, you're not able to see everything that's going on when in the daily practice to each employee. So you have to have some arenas where they can come with input. Where is then the opening when it comes to sharing knowledge? And when it comes to also learning in organization, then it's 3 things. I learn individually. I learn through the tasks that I actually are solving. And of course, if I do the same thing every time I'm at work, it's not learning. So it's about then developing through the tasks that I'm solving individually. But it's extremely much about this observing each other, being able to communicate with each other, being able to reflect together with your colleagues, and also this possibility to practice together. And that is also related to this, how can we get this balance? That's why I was very glad when you talked about this, because that's what we do all the time and need to be better at. How can we then have this exploitation in relation to going into a new direction and exploring new solutions in the organization? So how can we then create this strong learning culture? I was planning on being finished a bit earlier. I'm sorry
It's
about
okay.
that. What do you think?
How would you create a strong learning culture? That's the question. Do we have anybody who would like to answer it?
What do you think about I was talking about there? What do you think is the main thing that you have to focus on? Where to start?
I have a reflection when I've been listening to you, because I'm thinking when you say that these informal groups, that's where a lot of the learning happens. Doesn't that also have to do with trust? That you can, as a leader, trust these informal groups to actually create something that I can use as a leader? Because maybe that's where everything happens. So I can actually gain from lots of informal groups. And that has to do with trust as well, right?
Yeah. I think that's extremely important that you say that, because sometimes you're not so happy about what's happening. So then you can say who is going to be organized together with whom in the formal organization, and be concrete on that. But on other cases, I have a lot of experience when they actually have encouraged that. They have got their own budgets. It's more like this freedom of meeting informally as they want in the organization. And that is because very much, I said, what is the most important community of practice that you're in is very often related to your profession. And then, of course, people want to develop their profession and their professional knowledge in relation to that. If you're a lawyer, for instance, or if you have different, if you're working within the IT department, stuff like that. So if it's related to that, then of course to encourage that and people actually taking that responsibility themselves, that will of course benefit the organization and your department.
Yes, but then I think that sounds perfectly well. So if in a really good organization that would work perfectly. And I'm at the same time thinking maybe the police or other departments don't really think of it like that in the very top. So maybe in the ground level people work like that, and it comes lots of people who feel like, yes, I've got my own budget, I can do what I want, and I feel like I have a value because I work with what I want to do, and I feel like I'm actually making a difference. But then sometimes it stops. What do we do to change that?
I think that the first thing we have to do is that to take into account that we have different leadership levels.
Right.
That is a starting point. That we have to, because also in the literature we talk about leaders. Maybe the last 10 years or something, maybe less, we have talked about different leadership levels. So we talk about leaders as if the same way of being a top manager than being first line leaders. So it's starting to get to be more and more literature on what is this first line manager all about and middle manager all about. And I think that we have to start there to see that, okay, the different leadership levels is there for a reason.
Right.
So use it. But that has also something to do with them having the possibility to develop as well. But it should be also easy for top management to take advantage that you have different leadership levels. Because it has to start with the leaders.
And what you said before, you have to do things.
You
have to do things in all the levels, right?
Yeah. But another thing is also that I wanted to say is that it is bottom up. It can't be anything but bottom up when it comes to learning in organizations. And also when it comes to not being, when it's the other way around, you also have to look at what are you measured in relations to.
Right.
Because that is the same thing that is running towards the leaders on all level is what you're measured in accordance to. And if you're only measured on what is explicit, then what do you miss out on? So that is also part of that. Use the different leadership levels, but also be very, very aware of the measurements, the knowledge goals that you have in the organization. Before you came out and go on that, this is the checklist.
Right, so this is a photo moment.
This is the checklist on my life the last 25 years. This is a checklist. But I think it's what is important here is that first you have to work on this all the time, but also when you start on this, they say, of course people do all of this stuff already. And I think even though when I was together with the carpenters, being a professor, going into the building business, coming in there, and they were okay. That was the guys that was hanging in the lamps in school.
Yeah.
They're the first to recognize this.
Really?
Yeah, because they are the one going into the practice. They are the one getting the different drawings from others that are sitting in the office, trying to figure out how to actually adjust that to that. So this practice and the experience-based in learning is extremely important. Not just talking about education, about points or whatever it is, the formal thing. But this, I was thinking I just put that in yesterday because I knew that I wasn't able to go through them. And since you have all these workshops or different kind of activities, it could be a good idea.
Very useful.
Hopefully.
Thank you so much, Katina. A big hand for Cathrine.